Welcome to Probable Cause with Newsbud's founder and editor, Sibel Edmonds. Today, Sibel's guest is Michael Maharrey, who has a degree in mass communications and media studies, as well as a Bachelor of Science degree in accounting. He is a journalist who has written and reported for several newspapers and has authored 3 books on nullification. He serves as the National Communications Director for the 10th Amendment Center. Newsbud welcomes Michael Maharrey to Probable Cause with Sibel Edmonds.
Welcome to our show, and thank you very much for joining us on this extremely important topic with a top-notch website. And before I start with my first question, this is going to be very unusual for our viewers because they are used to listening to me talking about mainstream media, pseudo-alternative media outlets, criticizing them in terms of their biased coverage, whether based on partisanship or as ideologues, etc., or highly influenced outlets, influenced whether by special interests or the governments. Well, this is going to be a change because I'm going to start talking about a site that I have been a huge fan of for years, since the day I discovered the website. And I was going to make a list of all the reasons why I love 10th Amendment Center, including the blog section of 10th Amendment Center. I didn't have a time to do that, but I can start by some general elements, and then from there we'll move to the detailed elements. Number one, just when you go to the site, you see that the site is advertisement free, which is, to me, is extremely important. This is when I know that the site is independent from these mega corporations and their interests. So it's a clean website, none of those gunky, junky ads in. And I know you're funded by donations, and I don't see any infamous foundations such as Rockefeller's or Carnegie. And I'm sure George Soros would like to see you banned from the internet. So I don't see any foundation, that type of money influence, which is, again, in general level, is perfect. The other great elements that is very, very rare to find, and I'm out there every day for hours researching, reading constantly, is the fact that this site for all these years has been consistently nonpartisan. It's not a site that you say, oh, it's a right-wing site. Oh, no, it's a left-wing site. It is not an ideologue site, and that is extremely important to us because that's what we strive to be, because we are independent and we are 100% nonpartisan. Then the topic, the general premise and what you put out day after day, which every single one of them, if I were to mark to say, well, make sure you read this or read that, on any given day, I would say, make sure you read every single one of these posts. The great element, another great element about the site is, you know how with the media outlets, every day we are bombarded with so many awful news. And they are, factual, most of them, about how police state is expanding and how surveillance state is expanding, the wars. They are realities, but it gives this sense of powerlessness. When you read it, you're like, all these things are happening. And I, as an individual, can't do anything. I don't want to even look at it because it makes me frustrated. One of the great things about 10th Amendment Center as an organization, as a website, as a news analysis information source is every day it's also, in addition to giving some of these fact-based bad news, it's filled with good news. And that makes me feel good. I go to your site every morning and I see, oh, here's a state that just passed the bill on not allowing warrantless Stingray drones, for example. Or here's the state that said, no, we are not going to comply with Common Core. The reason I love this is saying, look, of all the things that are happening, and it's going, unfortunately, upwards, the police state, surveillance state, the government overreach, there are some good things happening within local level, within a state level, because it is so much easier. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's relatively speaking easier to tackle some of these obstacles that many of us and our viewers, it's like preaching to the choir. They are all against, they don't like it, but they feel frustrated. They're like, look, we send petition to the National Congress, nothing happens. Or the media exposes this and this and nothing happens. Yet your website says, actually, things are happening. And guess what? Things are not happening, from top to bottom. It's a bottom-up situation. Things are happening at the local level. With that, and having all this talk, I want to turn to you and have you explain to us why 10th Amendment and what is the number one reason for the existence of the 10th Amendment Center.
Well, first, I just want to thank you for all of those kind words, and it makes me feel good because
meant everyone.
You have expressed really a lot of our goals. I mean, a lot of the things that you've said are things that we've really endeavored to do as an organization to avoid, being tied up with these big corporations or the big influential donors, and trying to keep things positive and trying to be nonpartisan. All of those things are goals of the organization. So I'm glad that comes across when you read the website and see the material that we're putting out on a daily basis. So the 10th Amendment, I think, is probably the most important and most overlooked aspect of the Constitution. It's what they call a rule of construction. It really tells us how to read the Constitution. And essentially what it says is that all of the powers that were not delegated to the federal government, which are most all powers, those are supposed to remain with the states and with the people themselves. So in a nutshell, the federal government shouldn't be doing about 90% of what it's doing on a daily basis. And from a broader perspective, I think it's important because it gives us a structure of decentralization. And that's really, I think, the key and thrust of what we're trying to do. We do not think that centralized power is healthy in a political society. When you have too much power in the hands of too few people, you have a lot of potential for tyranny, a lot of potential for abuse of individual rights, abuses of minorities. All of these things come from centralizing power. The Constitution actually created a very decentralized system where most decision-making was left to the state and local level, where you'd have the 50 laboratories of ideas, as it's been described. What we have today, effectively, is a unitary state, and we've monopolized power. It's like having Walmart be the only place you can buy your groceries. Nobody would want that, and yet we have that in government. We have monopoly government, and it's not healthy. So our goal is to try to return to what the founders envisioned, a decentralized system, and we use this process of nullification that you mentioned to use state power to block overreach of the federal government. So that's what we do in a nutshell. And our mantra is this: follow the Constitution, every issue, every time, no exceptions, no excuses. That's really what we're all about. So we really do have an agenda. It's just not a partisan agenda. Our agenda is the Constitution.
Now, I totally understand why the federal government and the connected interests to the federal governments hate the 10th Amendment and this whole notion. That's understandable. I went through years of academic, studies, collecting all the useless degrees that I collected along the way, and one of them being a master's degree in public policy. And throughout my education in the United States, I came to the States in 1988 after I finished high school in Turkey. A very noticeable attitude or stand on 10th Amendment. You go through all these studies with the Constitution, Bill of Rights, and it seems like in every one of the courses I took, there's one amendment that they skip over, or there's like a one-liner there. And when I talked with various professors, the teachers, asking about some of these 10th Amendment related issues, they usually shake their head and saying, well, especially after Civil War and everything, that amendment is moot. And there is this attitude that they really wish it didn't exist. And if they could, and I'm sure one of these days is going to happen, they are going to basically erase it from the Constitution and say that, doesn't exist. So I even understand that, not that that is justified from the left liberal point of view that has been shaped, much of it, by misinformation. Next, I want to come to the media. With anytime that 10th Amendment Center comes up, whether it's with nullification, whether it's with Common Core, there is this unanimous, and I have to say unanimous, with the major, especially mainstream outlets, media outlets, and what I refer to well-funded pseudo-alternatives with the Carnegies and Soros and Rockefeller foundations. Immediately, 10th Amendment gets to be linked falsely to gender issues, to the race issues, to the religion issues. And anybody who wants to delve into the activism at the local level, targeting the state politicians and the states' rights, immediately they are categorized as the racist, sexist, skinhead. And that includes me. I come from olive race. I'm Caucasian, but, I'm really, really yellowish olive. And I come from a Muslim country. My background comes from that country. I'm a woman. And yet I actually have been called as a Nazi, fascist, KKK supporter. It gets so ridiculous because you can't even have constructive discussion with many of these people because they can't back it. All they do is they repeat like parrots what they read within mainstream media every single day, articles on this issue, which is they want to bring the plantations back. That's why they want the 10th Amendment Center. If you are pro-10th Amendment, you want to see those plantations back, and they're going to be back in the South. And then people are going to be turned into slaves, and it has been very successful, unfortunately, because it has become this systematic brainwash, people parroting it. What is your take on that? And considering that even some really good conservative sites, they stay away from it, how do you go about challenging it? Because I know you're challenging it on a daily basis.
I think there's two kind of things that come to mind as you mentioned this. And the first thing is I think it's a lot of it's by design. They don't want to have the debate about whether or not the federal government should run education. They don't want to have the debate about whether we should have a surveillance state. They don't want to have a debate about whether, Washington, D.C. should run healthcare. So it's easier to just say, well, they're all just a bunch of racists and a bunch of sexists and a bunch of horrible people, and they want slavery, because then nobody has to listen to our ideas. It's a way to marginalize everything that we're saying. And it makes it easier for them because they know they're going to lose the debate when it comes down to policy making and centralization and all of these other issues. So it's easier to say, well, he's a racist and we'll just write him off. But I think there's also an element of bad education in this. And, the truth of the matter is when it comes to nullification, it was actually most effective historically when northern states attempted and successfully blocked implementation and enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act. So these were northern states asserting state sovereignty, saying we're not going to cooperate with slave rendition. They actually used the arguments of John C. Calhoun to back up their position. William Lloyd Garrison, one of the famous abolitionists, said, I'm a nullifier. So the history is actually much more diverse when you talk about states' rights and nullification than anybody understands. But that's a failure of the education system. And that's one of the things that we try to do at the 10th Amendment Center. And I think we've been successful to a large degree because in the last 2 or 3 years, we're starting to see less and less of this race baiting and this accusation of being racist and all of this foolishness. And we're seeing more and more people beginning to debate the actual issues at hand. So, I consider that a success, and we're just going to continue teaching the actual history and trying to open up people's eyes.
After living in Washington, D.C. for 25 years, I got so disgusted. That's the place I consider Sin City, the real Sin City. It's not Vegas. It's Washington, D.C. I moved to Central Oregon. We are based in Bend, Oregon. And a couple of years ago, we had this whole issue of Malheur incident here, which we did provide some coverage. And we were attacked because when we tried to line up the facts on the federal land grabs and the case of, for example, Hammond's case, which is extremely important, is one of the biggest recent miscarriage of justice that has really gone truly uncovered by the mainstream media. We were told basically that covering this issue equates. So, I know you're saying that it's getting a little bit better, and I really hope you're right. But 2 years ago, witnessing Finnecam's shooting, seeing the treatments of this case and the false info, the propaganda being put by mainstream media, I really felt that, it was becoming this no-win situation. So I hope you're right. I hope it's becoming less and less, with this approach by the mainstream media, by the academia. And I have to say, I was also surprised to see that during that entire incident with Hammond case, there are some really, I call conservative, Republican doesn't equate conservative to me, or libertarians, for example. Like the Libertarian Party has become, I don't know how to describe it. It's and then you witness infighting, etc. But I was surprised that there was not even backing from some of the major sites, organizations, NGOs that consider themselves old-fashioned conservatives and constitutionalists. It was this attitude that if I touch this, I'm going to come under attack. So these constitutionalists and these ranchers, such as Hammonds, they were left without any support from any side, which was devastating to witness. One of the arguments people make, and after reading, and I'm going to read your books as well on nullification, after reading Tom Woods, seeing how he defeated that argument, was that the fact that states basically have 100% lost their teeth and their power because so much money they are getting from the federal government, whether from the education side, and it started with the highways, etc. They are so indebted to the federal government that they would never, ever dare challenging the federal government because, we hand over our share of tax and they are basically like butlers. They have to, each one of them, bow to the federal government. Can you tell us, in your opinion, is this a true statement? The fact that states being so dependent on federal government for funding, there is no way for them to stand up being indebted? Or do you believe that, no, this is not a correct statement? And if that's the case, why?
Well, I think it is a huge problem, all of the funding that flows in. I think that there is, again, some positive signs, though. A couple of years ago, the HUD changed some of the rules regarding the money that was being sent into cities for city improvements and that type of thing. So they attached a whole bunch of new strings. A lot of it had to do with, having affordable housing in certain areas and just a lot more regulatory structure in order to get these HUD grants. And this was under the Obama administration. And interestingly, we saw a number of cities that actually rejected the money, that had been taking this money for a number of years and then said, you know what, this is too much. So there actually is a point that the federal government can reach where at least local governments will say, whoa, we're gonna put the brakes on this because we're losing way too much of our own power over our own communities. But I think that this is an important thing for people to do at the state level, is to encourage their states to become more independent from the federal government. And at times to be willing to just say, you know what, you guys keep your money. We're going to handle this here at the state level. And another good thing that we've seen develop, and this was kind of a result of a court case, and I don't talk a whole lot about court cases because I'm not a real big fan of the Supreme Court because I don't think they usually pay any attention to the Constitution. But in the Sibelius ruling, which was part of the Obamacare case, they actually did hold that the federal government could not coerce states by using existing Medicaid funding to force them to expand, not Medicaid, Medicare, to enforce them to expand. So there actually is an evolving legal environment where the federal government is more limited in how it can utilize funding to coerce states into doing things that they want them to do. So, for instance, if there's some law enforcement issue, or a highway issue, The federal government can take away funding that's related to that issue if the state isn't taking that action, but they can't take away unrelated funding. So, they can't take away highway funding because the state refuses to do something in the realm of education. So the states actually have a lot more leeway than a lot of people believe. And I think it's just important for the states to continue to push those boundaries to free themselves from the federal money and become more and more willing to say, you know what, we don't need your money. We can handle this on our own. We'd rather have control over what we're doing with our own policies.
One of the positive developments have been the legalization of marijuana, and started with the state of Colorado. So a lot of people have gotten informed about the fact that with these kinds of issues, look, states can become independent, and people can have a say in, let's say, legalization or decriminalization of marijuana. They are also familiar with the concept, let's say, with issues such as Common Core. One of the great things that I have been reading constantly on your website goes to even more macro issues that most people believe it has nothing to do with the states and the federal government rules. And once they make the rule and implement those kinds of practices, that's it. There's no say that any state has. For example, you have been covering the issue of NDAA and rendition. And it has become topical again with North Carolina, these courageous, incredible, persistent activists saying, the fact that some of these planes took off from this particular Air Force Base, CIA planes, and they were used in these rendition program is unacceptable to us in the state of North Carolina. Tell us, how is it possible for states, and I will go through some of these topics, such as, let's say, rendition. What can people do at state level, and what kind of things states can do to, at least for the states saying we will not participate and here are the things we will do and nobody can force us?
Well, the dirty little secret is that the federal government depends on state and local resources and personnel to do almost everything that they do. So we see this in the war on drugs specifically, and this is why the state movement to legalize marijuana has been so effective, because 99% of the marijuana arrests actually occur under state law, not federal. So when the state legalizes it, the state law enforcement quits enforcing these laws. The federal government's left with virtually no way to enforce their will within the borders of that state. And this is true on a variety of issues. It takes state and local resources to implement Obamacare. It takes state and local resources to enforce federal gun laws. It takes state and local resources to implement education programs. Almost everything the federal government does requires state and local resources. And this actually extends, as you mentioned, to things that we don't really think of as being state and local issues. This North Carolina rendition was fascinating to me, and I just learned about it about a month ago. And as it turns out, there was a private aviation company that was based in North Carolina. It's a North Carolina corporation that was utilizing 2 regional airports in the state of North Carolina, and they were using those aircraft to do these rendition flights. So they were taking these prisoners, some of whom, as it turns out, weren't guilty of anything at all, and moving them to black sites in other countries where they could be questioned and tortured. And as it turns out, the state of North Carolina was providing support for the airport. This aviation company got tax benefits. One of the counties helped it build a hangar. So there was all kinds of state and local resources that were going into this company that was really a CIA front for rendition. Well, so what can a state do about that? James Madison gave us the advice in Federalist 46. He said, when the federal government does an unwarranted action, one of the things that a state can do is refuse to cooperate with officers of the Union. Those were the exact words that Madison used. So we've taken this model, refuse cooperation, and we've applied it to all of these different issues. And by refusing that cooperation, by withdrawing those resources and personnel, it takes away this vital support network that the federal government needs to accomplish all of the things that it wants to do. So imagine in North Carolina, if North Carolina had known that this was rendition was going on, and I'm almost certain that somebody in the government did know, they could have passed the law and said, you know what, we're not going to allow our state and local resources to be used for this purpose. And they could have withdrawn all that. This company would not have been able to get these tax benefits. It would not have been able to use these regional airports. And that would have probably not shut the program down, but it would have at least hindered the program. We've used the same model actually with NSA surveillance. And in Bluffdale, Utah, there's a huge mega data center that uses about 1.6 million gallons of water every single day to cool the supercomputers that are used to store all of this data that the NSA is gathering up. A lot of it warrantless and a lot of it on Americans. The city of Bluffdale, which is a subdivision of the state of Utah, is supplying this water to the NSA facility. They don't have to. The city of Bluffdale could say, you know what, we're not going to renew this contract, so you can't have our water. And this is perfectly legal. A lot of people say, well, you can't do that. But actually, the Supreme Court has held since 1842 that the federal government cannot force states or local governments to utilize their personnel or resources to enforce federal law or implement federal programs. So we have a very powerful tool at our disposal. We can pull our resources and our personnel at the state level away from all of these various things that the federal government are doing when they're overreaching and violating the Constitution, and essentially shut them down. And this is what we're talking about when we say nullification. We're not going to wipe the laws off the books, but we're going to make them unenforceable, and so they really don't matter in practice.
Another example I would like to have you address has to do with all the TSA abuses in the airports. My second name for a while was Miss Opt-Out because I have been opting out of everything. My daughter is 9 years old. She is opted out of Common Core, mandatory vaccination. Whenever we travel, whether for work or pleasure, basically, we happen to be from Newsbud with our camera crew, opting out. Here it is. I'm not going through that machine. We had some kind of momentum in 2005 or so. I was working together with some Ron Paul activists, and we were going to the airports in DC National Airport, giving handout, asking people, would they be interested on their rights to opt out, and why opt out was important. But unfortunately, I don't know, it died down. But during that period, if I remember correctly, it was Florida, state of Florida. Again, I'm not sure if it was the governor there. They floated the idea that they, as a state, they were going to opt out of TSA and all these abuses. And it got some media attention. I got excited. A lot of activists got excited. Again, that didn't go anywhere because the federal government said, well, you can opt out and not use TSA as long as you hire contractors instead of the TSA employees that we approve of with the federal government, then you can do it, which was like that defeats the purpose. I mean, if you're going to have the same kind of rules in terms of bend over, let us fondle you, let us stick our finger here and there, take off your shoes, just be pathetically diminished as a human being. If those are going to be practiced, except instead of a TSA, it's going to be XYZ contractors, that's not going to make any changes. And then the whole issue disappeared altogether. In this particular case, what kind of abilities, powers the states have? Because airports become a little bit of an iffy issue because, even though they are in the states, are we looking at these security, so-called security measures and everything, something that is like a, mother government, father government, it comes from top to bottom, you don't have a choice. What kind of things can be done at state level to prevent this, what we are going through, what we have been going through? And that is giving up on our dignities. There's no warrant to go through that search. And yet we are submitting just like robots, It has become so normalized. And it's like, you can touch me, you can touch my kid, you can go through my bag, you can subject me to these x-ray machines that are proven to cause cancer. And I have no say. What kind of say our states have when it comes to these TSA practices in our airports?
Well, I will preface this by saying I actually used to work in the airline industry, and I was in the airline industry in 2001 when 9/11 happened. So I saw the whole transition and the evolution of TSA. And I can tell all of your viewers emphatically that TSA security, by and large, is nothing but security theater. If you really think it's making you safer, you're absolutely nuts. It is not. All of this gross violation and literally humiliation a lot of times serves virtually no useful purpose. And so I really do think that I really don't like the TSA at all. And in fact, it's probably one of my most hated federal agencies, although there are probably many that are worse. But it's so in your face and such a violation. As you said, it's a violation not only of the Constitution and a right to privacy and this fact that they're searching us without a warrant, but it's a dignity thing when you have these strangers groping you in the airport. It's absolutely absurd, and I just absolutely hate it. I think what we need to see is we need to see a state to have guts. And I remember Florida talking about trying to privatize security, and exactly like you said, the federal government said, well, you can do that, but you have to use our approved contractors, and you're still using you still have to abide by our policies and our laws. But what happened in Texas, I think, is the model. And unfortunately, they didn't have the spine to continue and see it through. But if you remember back when they started doing the naked body scanners, they were making people walk through this thing, and it would literally allow the TSA to see your naked body. People were throwing a fit, and a lot of people were opting out, as you said. And so what they did was they then went to the grope. And so when you refused to go through the naked body scanner, they would do this very invasive, honestly would probably meet the definition of sexual assault. And a lot of people were very upset about this. So a legislator in the state of Texas introduced a bill to criminalize any touching by the TSA that touched your genitals, anything that was private, and would subject them to being charged with sexual assault. And this bill actually passed the House by an overwhelming margin. Now, unfortunately, by the time it got to the Senate, the federal government had gotten wind at this, and they threatened to shut down all of the airports in Texas if this bill passed, and the Senate kind of caved in and backed off. I wish the Senate would have passed the bill and let the federal government try to shut down all of the airports in Texas and watch the hue and cry that we would see in the public if virtually the entire United States air system was shut down, because that's what would happen. There's so many airline hubs in Texas. But unfortunately, they just didn't have the spine to continue to stand up. I would have loved to see the federal government try to justify, well, we're shutting down the airports because they're not letting us touch you. I don't think that would go over very well with the public. So we really need some people to have spine and to push back against these egregious and just in-your-face overreaches of federal power. Another thing that the states could do at the TSA level is refuse to allow their state and local law enforcement to enforce things at the checkpoint when it is a violation of the Constitution, when they get into these invasive searches. The TSA has no arrest powers. So if they have a problem, they call over the local law enforcement officer. Local law enforcement officer could say, no, I'm not going to be a party to this groping. So there are things that the state and local people could do at the airports to push back against this TSA. But like you said, it's a matter of having the courage and guts to do it. And I wanted to touch on something else you said. I love the whole opt-out thing. Opt out of Common Core, opt out of the TSA searches, opt out of everything you can, because this is the bedrock of nullification. States can pass laws and we can have local ordinances and good things can happen politically, but ultimately what we need are people who are willing to stand up and say, no, I'm not going to allow the federal government to violate my rights. I'm going to put into my body what I choose to put into my body. I'm going to educate my children as I see fit. I'm going to do the things that I want to do that are going to enrich my life. I don't care what the federal government says. We need more of that because that's the bedrock of nullification.
That's exactly what I wanted to get into next, because you know how they say the devil is in the details. So we start with amazing websites like yours and books like Nullification by Tom Woods. Next, it is at individual level, meaning individually we can opt out, and that is powerful. That is powerful. When, for example, you look at a school here in Oregon, I live in this neighborhood that is unfortunately very neoliberal, liberal-minded. So there has been only two parents in entire elementary school who have opted out. I'm one of the two. But it's powerful because when you go to the east side of Bend where I live, you see higher numbers. And that also causes some sort of panics because then the school is like, well, what are we going to do? Because this is a lot. And then they talk about they're going to lose funding because they need to submit the number of people who have opted out. And they claim they receive less funding from the federal government when they have higher number of people opting out. But how to, in terms of more as groups and more organized, because there are hundreds, if not thousands, of these so-called government watchdog organizations, and these are the NGOs. But when you look at them, whether it is, and they have wonderful names, POGO, Project on Government Oversight, GAP, Government Accountability Project. Who wouldn't want to support something called GAP, right? Then once you start digging and getting into it, you see that there are 7, 8 special interests, mega corporations, foundations that give all their funding, which they get tens of millions of dollars. Carnegie, Hewlett-Packard, George Soros is always at the top there. So people, they want to rely on NGOs, organizations like that, to give them some kind of a manual and say, gather here or contact your congressional person in this district to do this and that. Well, for these types of 10th Amendment great stuff, you never see any of those NGOs doing things like that. People then are left and saying, where do I get information? How do I organize? It basically boils down to how to, okay? I'll give you a little example. State of Oregon's Judicial Review Board, these are the people, this is a committee of 8, 10 people that you submit complaints about judges. And you have so many corrupt judges, and I'm sure you have it everywhere. Now with privatized prisons, we are tripling or maybe quadrupling. But State of Oregon's Judicial Review Board got the passing of F grade, meaning it's one of the worst 3. Oregon is like a very liberal state. They are environmentally active, et cetera, which is a big surprise for Oregon. All you have to do is look at the makeup of Judicial Review Committee in Oregon, and right away you know why it has been so bad and why it has received this grade of F, failing. Number one, there is zero transparency. Of the thousands of tens of thousands or hundreds of cases, nobody knows because they keep it classified how many complaints they receive. They never publish the complaints. And when you send a complaint with documented evidence on a judge who is corrupt, has received bribery, etc., to them, you acknowledge that it comes with a gag order. Thou shalt not disclose it to the media or anywhere else that you have filed a complaint with the Judicial Committee to look into this particular judge's deeds. So nobody knows how many complaints. It's estimated that it's in hundreds per year minimum. And they have not removed or investigated or gotten rid of more than one judge in the past 25 years. So you would think we have the squeakiest judges in the country, which is absolutely the opposite. Now you look at the makeup of this board, 99% of them are active attorneys and very successful law firms, like they make millions of dollars, and they are still practicing law. And they bring their cases before these judges that they are supposed to be investigating. So even if you have the minimum level of IQ, you look at the way it's set up, the system, you say, well, of course they're going to get grade F. Of course they haven't investigated any judges because their income, everything they earn depends on these judges to be on the good side of these judges. I said, okay, what can be done? Then I started looking into issue of ballots. What does it take in terms of gathering signatures from the community, from the people, from people in Oregon? How many signatures does it take for it to go into so that it can be on the ballot. So people say, we want to change the makeup. We want to remove this system. We want to replace it by, randomly chosen from different vocational backgrounds people, not all attorneys with law firms. But then when you want to do that, you realize that it's going to take resources in terms of some people volunteering to lead, okay, say, okay, here are the laws, here's what we can do, here's how we can do it. So it would be grassroots activism. But then when you want to gather people to do that, you see that people are like, well, I'm busy, I have a job, 9 to 5. I brought it up on our website. I said, Les, I want to experiment with this. And one gentleman, a very nice community member, subscriber, said, well, I'm a grandfather. I'm retired, but I'm busy raising and taking care of my grandchildren. I don't have time. It's this, without some sort of, even if it's loosely organized place that are non-NGOs, not connected to the foundations, it becomes very hard, I don't want to say impossible, to have this grassroots movement organized and get these things done because they are doable. Because when I was looking at the number of signatures required for this to go on ballot, and I can't imagine, no matter whether they are liberals or conservatives, anybody not saying yes to it. It says, in order to bring integrity, this system doesn't work. We need to replace it by this. So it's not some kind of a polarized issue that you got to campaign for it. Who wouldn't vote for it? But on the other hand, to apply it, it takes resources and organizations. And I'm sure you're getting this all the time at your center, 10th Amendment Center, people saying, I would like to do this in my state. How do I go about doing this? What kind of resources we can put together to organize so we can put the word out and get things done? What are the steps? What are the advices you give people who come to you, to 10th Amendment Center, and say, how do I start doing this? I have done it at individual level. I have opted out, but I want to organize grassroots. I want some kind of resources to get more people and get more things done at state and local level.
Well, it's kind of like the Nike commercial, at some point you got to just do it. And I think we suffer from this mentality in the United States that we can't really make a difference. And I think it comes from most of the time when people are trying to make a difference, they're trying to make a difference in Washington, D.C. So they're trying to influence their congressman or their senator. And those people don't care what you have to say. If you're not a lobbyist with deep pockets, they couldn't care less. I know my experience of calling my congressman has been talking to an intern, and then about, 3 weeks later, I get a form letter that may or may not relate to what I talked to the congressman's intern about in the first place. So I think people feel like that it's kind of fruitless. So they're not much inclined to get involved in the first place. And then I think there's also this mentality that, well, like you said, I just don't have time. And they don't realize that it doesn't necessarily take a huge time commitment to make a very significant difference. And I'll give you an example. Just yesterday, a bill passed in Michigan that would end the use of state and local resources for warrantless spying. So it's directed at the NSA. It's a bill that's designed to make it more difficult for the federal government to spy on us without a warrant. And basically, it says if you're going to spy on us without a warrant, our police departments, our local agencies, we're not going to help with that. It's a great bill, passed the Michigan House. It's going to move on to the Michigan Senate. So we did some reporting on that, and I got an email yesterday in the evening after we put out our report from a guy in West Virginia, and he was all excited. He said, I saw this report, and I decided I was going to email some senators here in West Virginia and tell them about this bill and tell them how important it was. And he said, I spent a little bit of time sending out some emails, and he said, and I got a response from one of the senators, and she's really interested in what we're doing, and we're going to talk more about it. And I gave her the resources from your website, and so she's going to look at introducing this bill in West Virginia. This guy maybe spent 30 minutes sending out some emails. And he has now set in motion the possibility of this bill being introduced in his state. So it doesn't take, $1 million and a commitment of 40 hours of work necessarily to get something done. If you look at the 10th Amendment Center website and you see that there's a bill in your state that's pending in your legislature, you can make a call to the members on that particular committee that the bill is being heard in. And that would maybe take you 15 minutes to do that, maybe a half hour. That phone call could influence a committee member to vote yes on a bill, because these folks at the state and local level, they don't get all of the phone calls and all of the letters and stuff that the Congress people get. They're more they can go for months without ever hearing from a constituent. So you have a powerful opportunity to have influence by just spending a very little bit of time. And that's one of the things we try to do at the 10th Amendment Center, is provide resources. We have model legislation. We have the various issues that we work on, and folks can use those resources, get them into the hand of their state and local representatives, make phone calls as it's moving through the process, and really have a significant impact with a very minimal investment of time and energy. We all have an hour or so a day that we could spend on activism. We all sit in front of the TV. We all sit around and do things that, may or may not add any value. We could just take 1 week of that TV, an hour, and we can make a huge difference in our local or state community.
Yeah, even if it's 1 hour a week, I completely agree with you. And do you consider, as experts with 10th Amendment Center, ballots as a powerful tool to bring about changes, the needed changes for some of these changes?
Absolutely. I wish people would be more involved in their state and local elections. Most people don't pay a whole lot of attention. I know a lot of people who don't even know who their state representative is or their state senator. And like I said, we can have a great deal of influence. That's why they care when they get a phone call from us, because we're dealing with a lot fewer votes. We're dealing with a lot less special interest money. We're dealing with a situation where individuals matter to these people in terms of them being able to get reelected. So, a small group of people pushing a particular candidate based on their performance on 10th Amendment issues, on state sovereignty, on issues that you care about, can make a huge difference at the ballot box. I think we spend way too much time and money worrying about who's going to be the president and who's going to be in Congress and who's going to be in the Senate. Basically, it doesn't matter who is in those positions. The car is broken. You can put whoever you want in the driver's seat of a broken down car. It's not going to make any difference. But at the state and local level, these candidates can have an influence, and you can have an influence on these candidates. So I wish people would spend more time involved, with local and state races as opposed to the national politics that everybody gets all caught up in.
I couldn't agree with you more. Last month, we went to Texas. We had 5 days of very fruitful activism together with some activists in Texas. We had several people with our camera crews, and this had to do with oversight and the briberies and issues involving these charter schools that are owned by certain groups in Texas. But it was a beginning. A lot of people, they think, you go somewhere, you do picketing and do that, and it's a done deal. You have to keep at it. You have to keep on top of it. You can't give up. You have to be persistent. You have to be consistent, because if they see you come and do it once and then go away, they're like, okay, I'll just ignore it. And with this particular case, we promised, and we are going to do that. The primaries there is going to happen around first week in March 5th or 6th. So mid-February till that time is a very important period. So thanks to our supporters, with our community, we don't get any ads from any corporation, no advertisements. We are not attached to any foundations. And it's basically members support, our subscribers community. But we are going back there, and we are going to do exactly that. There are candidates. For example, in this particular case, we want to unseat a lieutenant governor. Well, he's the incumbent, and his campaign currently has $21 million of spending money for the campaign. His opponents, the top one, has $40,000. And to show that, don't let that scare you, because as alternative media outlets using some of these tools of communications and grassroots, let's prove that it doesn't have to be only money politics. As you said, with the political theater, it doesn't matter if it's Clinton or Obama or Trump. It doesn't make any difference. And there is this I guess it's the Pollyanna way of thinking for people. They want to believe that they can have one hero elected, and that hero, whoever it is, right or left, is going to drain the swamp. And that's what I was saying to people. It's like, you know who can drain the swamp? We can drain the swamp. We have to say, how do we go about draining the swamp? But sitting back and saying one or two individuals going to go out there and drain the entire swamp, this swamp that's been around for a long time, and it's very, very big. It's very, very deep. But again, as I said, the media perpetuates that. And so how I want to end this is this. We truly support your site, and we are telling with this interview, but we will also put more of your articles out there in terms of links in our coverage, news coverage. Is we would like to be there. We're going to be on your mailing list so that we get heads up. For example, if anything that's going to happen in the state of Oregon, I would like to know. And now that we are a small media organization, there's more than one of us. There are things we can do today with our camera, with our iPhone, documenting it, putting it out there. Probably they are still working on taking away these abilities from us, because that is threatening to the big special interests. But we would like to, in any way that we can, support your work as well, because there are not many of us in terms of entities that are not right, they are not left, they are not ideologues, they are not attached to this money. As you said, all this money, all these dollars comes with strings attached. Whether you're a congressman who gets big money from the lobbyists, or if you're an NGO with a great sounding name and you're getting $10 million from George Soros, that money is not handed to you, so you go and do good stuff. There are strings attached, and people need to wake up and actually participate, even if it's starting with 1 hour, 1.5 hours a week, saying, I did my active citizenry. I was a responsible citizen. And we have to look inward instead of looking outwards. And with that, I want to thank you for joining us. I'm going to sign up with your email database. Please inform us. If you have events, conferences, please let us know. If there are in some locations that we can easily get to, we would like to cover and publish it on our website. I love the bio of your founder there on the website when he's saying, I'm not Republican, I'm not Democrat. I am me. I am me. And I like to see more founders coming up with more, information source organizations like yours. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking with you. I've really enjoyed it.